Some moments define who we truly are, even when nobody's watching. For Jacob Miller, that moment came on Christmas Eve when he gave away his family's only train ticket to a stranger in tears. Jacob works at the lumber mill, raising his 5-year-old daughter alone in their small duplex. When a desperate woman appears at the train station, begging for help to reach her dying mother, Jacob doesn't think twice. He hands over their ticket and watches their Christmas plans disappear with the train. 3 days later, that woman returns with a luxury car and a plan to change everything. But can Jacob accept help from someone he barely knows? Will this act of kindness finally bring the blessing his struggling family deserves? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced the December darkness at 5:30, just as it had every morning for the past 3 years. Jacob Miller's calloused hand found the button with practiced precision, silencing the noise before it could wake the small figure curled beneath the pink comforter in the bed across the room. 5-year-old Lily slept with the peaceful abandon that only children possess, her dark hair fanned across the pillow like her mother's used to be. Jacob sat on the edge of his narrow bed, running weathered fingers through graying hair that seemed to have more silver streaks each passing month. At 47, he felt older than his years, worn down by the relentless pressure of single parenthood and the constant worry that kept him awake most nights. The duplex they called home was nothing like the house Sarah had dreamed, of cramped rooms with thin walls, drafty windows that let in the cold, and a heating system that worked only when coaxed with patience and prayer. But it was theirs, and that meant everything. He moved quietly through their morning routine, muscle memory guiding him as he prepared coffee in the small kitchen. The percolator was older than Lily, a wedding gift from Sarah's grandmother that had somehow survived 3 moves and countless mornings, just like this one. The familiar gurgling sound brought comfort, a small constant in a world that seemed determined to shift beneath his feet. Through the kitchen window, rolling oaks stretched out in the pre-dawn gloom of town that had seen better days, when the railroad was king and prosperity flowed through these streets like a river. Now, boarded storefronts outnumbered open businesses 3-1, and the train station that had once been the heart of the community stood empty, its windows dark and its platform cracked with weeds growing through the concrete. Jacob had grown up here when Rolling Oaks was thriving, when families filled the sidewalks on Saturday evenings and the sound of train whistles marked the rhythm of daily life. He'd met Sarah at the summer festival when they were both 18, dancing under strings of lights while the whole town celebrated another good harvest. They'd married in the little church on Maple Street, bought their first house 2 blocks from where he'd grown up, and planned a future that seemed as solid as the oak trees that gave their town its name. Cancer had different plans. "Daddy," Lily's sleepy voice drifted from the bedroom, pulling him back to the present. "Is it morning time?" "Almost, sweetheart," he called softly, abandoning his coffee to check on her. She was sitting up in bed, her favorite stuffed elephant clutched in small arms, hair sticking up in impossible directions. Even in the dim light, her eyes, Sarah's eyes, sparkled with the curiosity that made every day an adventure. "Can we have pancakes?" Jacob's heart clenched as he remembered the near-empty pantry. Payday wasn't until Friday, and they were down to the basics: oatmeal, bread, and a few cans of soup. "How about oatmeal with cinnamon sugar? We can pretend it's fancy porridge like in the fairy tales." Lily's face lit up with genuine delight. At 5, she hadn't yet learned that cinnamon sugar on oatmeal was a poor substitute for real treats. Her ability to find joy in simple things both broke his heart and gave him strength to face another day. While she got dressed, a process that involved serious consideration of which socks matched her mood, Jacob prepared for another 10-hour shift at Morrison Lumber Mill. The work was hard, physical labor that left his back aching and his hands rough, but it paid the bills, barely. Pete Morrison, whose father had started the mill 40 years ago, did his best to take care of his workers, but orders had been declining as construction slowed throughout the region. Jacob had been picking up overtime whenever possible, working Saturdays, and staying late during the week. Every extra hour meant a few more dollars in their account, a small buffer against the uncertainty that seemed to hover over their lives like storm clouds. "Mrs. Chen said she's making cookies today," Lily announced as Jacob helped her into a winter coat. The kind with chocolate chips that looked like little smiles. Mrs. Chen lived in the other half of their duplex, a widow in her 70s who had become their unofficial grandmother. She watched Lily after school until Jacob got home from work, refusing payment despite his repeated attempts to compensate her. "You help me more than I help you," she would insist, waving away his concerns. "Lily brings sunshine to this old house." The truth was, Jacob didn't know what he would do without Mrs. Chen. Daycare in the county seat cost more than he could afford, and the local options were limited. Mrs. Chen's gentle presence in their lives had been a blessing he'd never expected, one of the few bright spots in the difficult years since Sarah's death. Walking Lily to school meant a 6-block journey through the heart of Rolling Oaks, past the shuttered grocery store where they used to shop, the empty lot where Henderson's Hardware had stood until last spring, and the old movie theater that now housed a thrift shop open 3 days a week. Lily chatted about her upcoming Christmas program, her excitement infectious despite the grey December morning. "Are you coming to watch me sing, Daddy?" "Wouldn't miss it for the world," he promised, making a mental note to arrange coverage at the mill. Pete was understanding about family obligations, but Jacob hated asking for special treatment. Lincoln Elementary had been built in the 1950s, and the years showed in its worn brick facade and dated playground equipment. But the teachers cared deeply about their students, and Lily thrived under their attention. Miss Rodriguez, her kindergarten teacher, greeted them at the door with a warm smile that made Jacob feel less alone in the world. "Good morning, Lily. Are you ready for our special Christmas craft today?" "We're making ornaments from pine cones," Lily explained to Jacob with 5-year-old authority. "And then we're going to sing our Christmas songs for practice." Jacob hugged her goodbye, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and the childhood sweetness that seemed to surround her like an invisible shield. These moments, the simple, everyday connections, had become precious beyond measure. He'd learned not to take any of them for granted. The drive to Morrison Lumber took him past the old train depot, and he slowed despite himself. The building that had once been Rolling Oaks' connection to the larger world now stood abandoned, its red brick walls weathered and windows boarded. Weeds grew through cracks in the platform where families had once gathered to welcome visitors or bid farewell to loved ones heading to opportunities in distant cities. Sarah had loved that station. She used to bring sandwiches and sit on the platform on summer evenings, watching for the occasional freight train that still passed through town. "Someday," she'd say, "we'll take Lily on a real train trip, maybe to the mountains or all the way to the ocean." That dream, like so many others, had died with her. At the mill, the familiar sounds and smells enveloped him, the whine of saw blades, the sweet scent of fresh-cut pine, the easy banter of men who'd worked together for years. Pete Morrison waved from his office window, and Jacob raised a hand in response before checking the assignment board. Today would be inventory and preparation work, getting orders ready for shipment to contractors across 3 counties. "Jake," Tommy Hendricks called from across the yard. "Emma called the office, said she tried your cell but couldn't get through." Jacob's sister lived 4 hours away in Millbrook, where her husband managed a successful accounting firm and their 2 boys played in a youth hockey league that traveled to tournaments every weekend. Emma called regularly, checking on them with the persistent worry of an older sister who felt guilty for having escaped Rolling Oaks before the economic decline hit hardest. He returned her call during his lunch break, sitting in his truck with a thermos of coffee and a sandwich that would have to last until dinner. "Jacob, thank goodness." Emma's voice carried relief and something else, excitement, maybe. "I was hoping to catch you before you made other plans." "Other plans for what?" "Christmas. The boys are so excited to see Lily, and Mark's parents are coming too. We're planning this whole elaborate celebration." Jacob closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of his sister's good intentions. Emma wanted to help, wanted to include them in her family's comfortable middle-class holiday traditions, but she didn't understand how complicated simple things had become. I appreciate the invitation, but nothing. Your family, and family spends Christmas together. I already looked up the train schedule. There's a 3 o'clock departure on Christmas Eve that gets you here by 7. Perfect timing for dinner and the boys' bedtime. Train tickets. Jacob did quick calculations in his head round-trip fares for him and Lily, plus the cost of gifts for Emma's family, meals, the time off work. It would strain their budget past the breaking point. But how could he disappoint Lily? How could he deny her the chance to be part of a real Christmas celebration, the kind she saw in picture books and television commercials? "Let me think about it," he said, knowing he'd already made the decision. Somehow, he'd make it work. "Don't think too long," Emma warned gently. "Christmas Eve tickets sell out, especially the affordable ones." After work, Jacob picked up Lily from Mrs. Chen's apartment, where the air always smelled like jasmine tea and something delicious cooking on the stove. Today, the promised chocolate chip cookies waited on a plate, still warm from the oven. "2 each," Mrs. Chen announced with mock sternness. "Any more will spoil your dinner." Lily dutifully selected her cookies, while Jacob accepted a cup of tea and the day's report on his daughter's activities. Mrs. Chen had been a teacher before retirement, and she treated Lily's after-school hours like an extension of her education, reading together, working on puzzles, practicing letters and numbers through games that felt like play. "She talked about Christmas plans today," Mrs. Chen said quietly while Lily examined her cookies for the perfect first bite. "Something about visiting Aunt Emma." Jacob nodded, feeling the weight of the decision settle on his shoulders. "Train tickets are expensive, but some things are worth the cost," Mrs. Chen finished with understanding. "Children need connections to extended family, especially—" She paused, diplomatic enough not to finish the thought, "especially children who've lost a parent." That evening, after a dinner of grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, Jacob sat at their small kitchen table with his laptop and a calculator, working out the budget for their Christmas trip. The numbers were unforgiving. Train tickets would cost nearly $200, money they didn't really have. But Lily deserved better than another quiet Christmas in their duplex, another year of homemade gifts and creative explanations for why Santa's visit had been modest. He could work extra shifts in January, maybe pick up some weekend construction work with the crew that was renovating the old Masterson house. They'd eat more oatmeal and fewer groceries, but it would be worth it to see Lily's face light up in her cousin's playroom, to watch her participate in the kind of Christmas morning he remembered from his own childhood. From her bed across the room, Lily's voice drifted sleepily through the darkness. "Daddy, are we really going to see Aunt Emma for Christmas?" "Yes, sweetheart. We're going to take the train, just like in your storybooks." "Will there be other kids on the train?" "Maybe. We'll have to wait and see." "I hope so. Trains are more fun when there are kids to wave at the farms and count the cows." Jacob smiled in the darkness, remembering his own childhood train trips with his parents, when the world outside the windows had seemed full of endless possibilities. Maybe this trip would give Lily some of those same magical memories. He fell asleep that night planning their Christmas adventure, unaware that a simple act of kindness would soon change the course of their lives forever. The train ticket he would purchase tomorrow, scraped together from overtime, pay, and careful budget cuts, would become the instrument of transformation, though not in any way he could possibly imagine. In her small bed across the room, Lily dreamed of train whistles and Christmas morning, her stuffed elephant keeping watch as December snow began to fall outside their window, covering Rolling Oaks in a blanket of quiet beauty that made even the empty storefronts look peaceful in the moonlight. Christmas Eve morning arrived, with the kind of bitter cold that made breath visible and turned car windows into sheets of ice. Jacob had been awake since 4, double-checking their small suitcase and making sure Lily's favorite travel snacks were packed alongside the few wrapped gifts they were bringing to Emma's family. The train ticket, single piece of cardboard that had cost him 3 overtime shifts, sat safely in his wallet, representing hope and sacrifice in equal measure. Lily bounced between excitement and nervousness as they prepared for their adventure. She'd never been on a train before, and her questions came in rapid succession while Jacob helped her into her warmest coat and scarf. "Will the train be loud, Daddy? Will we see horses from the window? What if I have to use the bathroom while we're moving?" "The train will be a little loud, but it's a good sound," Jacob answered patiently, zipping her jacket and adjusting her mittens. "We'll see lots of things from the window, farms and forests and maybe some horses, and there are bathrooms on the train, so don't worry about that." Mrs. Chen appeared at their door just as they were ready to leave, carrying a small wrapped package and wearing the kind of smile that suggested she was up to something. "A little something for the trip," she said, pressing the package into Lily's hands. "Don't open it until you're on the train." "What is it?" Lily asked, turning the package over in her small hands. "A surprise is only a surprise if you wait to find out," Mrs. Chen replied with theatrical mystery. She turned to Jacob, her expression becoming more serious. "Have a wonderful time. Don't worry about anything here. I'll keep an eye on the place." The drive to the train station took them through the heart of Rolling Oaks, past the Christmas decorations that the town council had managed to put up, despite their shrinking budget. Modest wreaths hung from the old-fashioned streetlights, and the courthouse lawn displayed a small nativity scene that had been donated by the Methodist Church. Even in its economic struggles, the community tried to maintain the traditions that had defined Christmas in Rolling Oaks for generations. The train station stood at the end of Railroad Avenue, a beautiful red brick building that had been constructed in 1923 when the town was thriving and the future seemed limitless. Now it served as a small depot for the regional passenger service that connected rural communities to larger cities, though only 2 trains per day stopped in Rolling Oak Zone, heading north toward the state capital, one heading south toward the university town where Emma lived. Jacob parked in the small lot beside the station, noting with relief that they weren't the only travelers on Christmas Eve. Several other cars sat in the spots closest to the platform, and he could see people waiting inside the modest waiting room. The sight of other families made the journey feel more normal, less like the desperate financial stretch it actually represented. "Look, Daddy," Lily pointed toward the tracks, where signal lights glowed red in the distance. "Is that our train coming?" "Not yet, sweetheart. Our train doesn't arrive for another 20 minutes. Inside the waiting room, the atmosphere was quietly festive. A small Christmas tree stood in one corner, decorated with handmade ornaments that looked like they'd been crafted by local school children. The woman behind the ticket window wore a Santa hat and seemed genuinely pleased to see customers on what was probably a slow day for train travel. Jacob checked their tickets one more time, reviewed the departure time, and tried to calm the nervous energy that had been building since morning. This trip represented more than just Christmas with family. It was proof that he could still provide Lily with experiences beyond their everyday struggles, that her childhood wouldn't be defined entirely by financial limitation and loss. They found seats on one of the wooden benches that lined the waiting room, and Lily swung her legs contentedly while examining Mrs. Chen's mysterious package. Other passengers sat nearby, an elderly couple heading to visit grandchildren, a young man in military uniform traveling home for the holidays, and a middle-aged woman who kept checking her phone with increasing anxiety. Jacob Miller. He looked up to see the woman with the phone approaching their bench. She was well dressed in a long wool coat and leather boots, with graying hair pulled back in an elegant bun. Her face was lined with worry, and her hands shook slightly as she spoke. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I heard you mention Rolling Oaks to the ticket agent. You're taking the southbound train?" "Yes, that's right." Jacob stood, instinctively protective but curious about her obvious distress. "I'm Nora Whitman. Her voice broke, and she took a shaky breath before continuing. "I need to get to University Hospital as quickly as possible. My mother had a heart attack this morning, and the doctors say—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Jacob felt his stomach drop. He recognized the look in her eyes, the desperate fear of someone watching a loved one slip away. He'd worn that same expression during Sarah's final days. "I drove here from Chicago," Nora continued, her words tumbling together. "But my car broke down just outside town, and the local garage is closed for the holiday. The ticket agent said this train is sold out, but I thought maybe if someone didn't show up." Jacob glanced toward the platform, where other passengers were beginning to gather as the train's arrival time approached. The southbound service was indeed popular on Christmas Eve, carrying people toward family gatherings and holiday celebrations. The chances of a no-show passenger were slim. "How long do the doctors think?" Jacob began, then stopped himself. Some questions were too painful to ask directly. "They don't know," Nora whispered. "She's stable for now, but at her age, every hour matters. I should have been there this morning, but I was in a business meeting, and by the time I got the call..." She covered her face with her hands, overwhelmed by regret and fear. Lily tugged on Jacob's sleeve, her young face serious with concern. "Daddy, is the lady sad because someone is sick?" "Yes, sweetheart. Her mother is very sick, and she needs to get to the hospital." Lily considered this information with the gravity that children sometimes bring to adult problems. Like when Mommy was sick. The simple question hit Jacob like a physical blow, bringing back memories of his own desperate drives to the hospital, his own frantic phone calls and sleepless vigils. He remembered the helpless feeling of being unable to fix what was broken, unable to stop time from stealing away the person he loved most. He looked at the train ticket in his hand, then at Nora's tear-streaked face, then at his daughter's trusting eyes. Emma would understand. She'd be disappointed, but she'd understand. Lily might not fully grasp why they couldn't go to Aunt Emma's, but she would accept his explanation with the resilience that had carried her through bigger losses. The decision made itself. "Take our ticket," Jacob said quietly, extending the piece of cardboard toward Nora. She stared at him in disbelief. "I can't. You're traveling with your daughter. This is your Christmas." "Christmas will happen with or without a train ride," Jacob interrupted gently. "Your mother needs you more than we need to go anywhere. But I can pay you. Let me give you money for the ticket." Jacob shook his head firmly. "It's not about money." Nora's hands trembled as she accepted the ticket, and tears spilled down her cheeks. "I don't know how to thank you. I don't even know your name." "Jacob Miller. And this is Lily." "Lily," Nora repeated, kneeling to the child's level. "Thank you for sharing your daddy with me. I promise I'll use this ticket to go help my mother feel better." Lily nodded solemnly. Sometimes people need help more than other people need train rides. Outside, the southbound train approached with a deep whistle that echoed across the empty platform. Jacob picked up their suitcase and took Lily's hand, walking toward the exit, while other passengers moved toward the boarding area. "Aren't we getting on the train?" Lily asked, confusion finally breaking through her acceptance. "Not today, sweetheart. We're going to help Mrs. Nora get to her mother instead." They stood in the parking lot and watched the train pull away, carrying Nora toward her family emergency and taking their Christmas plans with it. Jacob felt the familiar weight of sacrifice, but also something else, quiet satisfaction that came from doing the right thing when it mattered most. "Are we going home now?" Lily asked, as they loaded their suitcase back into the truck. "Yes, we're going home. But first, let's call Aunt Emma and explain what happened. Will she be sad that we can't come?" Jacob started the engine and turned up the heat, watching the train disappear around a distant bend. "She might be disappointed, but she'll understand. Sometimes the best gift we can give is helping someone else when they need it most." As they drove back through rolling oaks, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just occurred, though he had no way of knowing how profoundly this moment of kindness would reshape their lives. The train ticket that had represented their Christmas dreams was gone, but in its place was the quiet knowledge that they had acted with compassion when it mattered most. Lily fell asleep during the short drive home, clutching Mrs. Chen's unopened gift and processing the morning's unexpected turn of events. Jacob carried her inside and tucked her into bed for a nap, then sat at their kitchen table and called Emma to explain why they wouldn't be arriving for Christmas dinner. His sister's disappointed silence stretched across the phone line before she finally spoke. "Jacob, you gave away your train ticket to a complete stranger?" Her mother was dying, Em. "What else could I do?" Another pause, then a sigh that carried both frustration and admiration. "The same thing you always do, put everyone else's needs before your own." As Christmas Eve settled into quiet afternoon, Jacob had no way of knowing that Nora Whitman would spend the next 3 days at her mother's bedside in University Hospital, watching the woman who had raised her slowly recover from what doctors would later call a surprisingly mild heart attack. He couldn't predict that Nora would use those long hospital hours to research the small town where a stranger had saved her final goodbye, or that she would discover a connection to Rolling Oaks that went far deeper than a broken-down car and a missed train. All Jacob knew was that he had acted from the heart, and that somehow their quiet Christmas Eve at home felt exactly right. Christmas morning dawned with the soft light that comes only with fresh snow, and Jacob woke to find Lily already awake, sitting cross-legged on her bed and staring out the window at the transformed world outside. Rolling Oaks looked like a postcard under its white blanket, with even the most weathered buildings appearing clean and hopeful in the winter light. "It snowed while we were sleeping," Lily announced with the wonder that children reserve for unexpected magic. "Do you think Santa knew we stayed home?" Jacob's heart squeezed at the question, remembering the modest gifts hidden in his closet, things he'd made or found at the thrift store, wrapped with care but humble compared to what other children might find under their trees. "I think Santa always knows where good children are," he said, pulling on his robe and slippers. Their Christmas celebration was simple but deliberate. Jacob had prepared as much as their budget allowed, and what they lacked in material abundance, he tried to make up for with attention and creativity. The small tree they'd bought for $5 at the grocery store stood in their living room corner, decorated with ornaments Lily had made from construction paper and yarn, along with a few precious glass balls that had belonged to Sarah. Under the tree, 3 carefully wrapped packages waited alongside the gift Mrs. Chen had given Lily for their train journey. Jacob had spent hours crafting a dollhouse from scrap lumber and paint samples from the hardware store, creating tiny furniture from cardboard and fabric scraps. For weeks, he'd worked on it during his lunch breaks, and after Lily fell asleep, sanding rough edges and painting delicate details by lamplight. Lily's reaction made every hidden hour worthwhile. She gasped when she unwrapped the dollhouse, running her small fingers over the miniature rooms and exclaiming over tiny details: a working front door, windows with real glass, and a small family of wooden figures Jacob had carved during quiet evenings. "It's the most beautiful house in the whole world," she declared, immediately beginning to arrange the furniture and move the wooden family from room to room. "Look, Daddy's little girl even has her own bedroom, just like me." The second package contained a wooden recipe box, something Jacob had discovered in Sarah's things and carefully restored. Inside, he'd placed index cards with simple recipes they could make together: cookies, pancakes, sandwiches, each one written in his careful handwriting with notes about why Sarah had loved that particular dish. "This was Mommy's," he explained gently as Lily examined the cards. "She used to write down all her favorite recipes so she wouldn't forget how to make the things that made people happy." Lily held the cards reverently, though she couldn't yet read the words. "Can we make something from Mommy's recipes today?" "Absolutely. What sounds good?" After careful consideration, Lily chose the recipe for cinnamon rolls, something Sarah had made every Christmas morning, filling their old house with the scent of yeast and spice. Jacob had simplified the recipe and made sure they had all the ingredients, though it would require careful stretching of their grocery budget. The third package was Mrs. Chen's contribution to their train journey, and Lily opened it with the ceremony due to a gift that had waited through their adventure's postponement. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a small photo album filled with pictures Mrs. Chen had taken of Lily over the past months, playing in their tiny backyard, helping with simple cooking projects, reading books curled up in the elderly woman's favorite chair. "She made me a book about myself," Lily marveled, turning the pages slowly. "Look, there's me feeding the birds, and there's me helping plant flowers." Jacob felt his throat tighten as he looked at the photographs, seeing his daughter through Mrs. Chen's loving eyes. Each picture captured Lily's natural joy and curiosity, preserving moments he might have missed in the daily rush of work and responsibility. It was an unexpected gift, not just the album itself, but the reminder that other people saw and valued his remarkable little girl. They spent the morning in their pajamas, playing with the dollhouse and mixing cinnamon roll dough, according to Sarah's carefully preserved instructions. Lily stood on a chair beside the counter, measuring flour with intense concentration and asking questions about each step of the process. "Why do we have to wait for the dough to get bigger?" "Because the yeast needs time to work its magic," Jacob explained, echoing words Sarah had used years earlier. "Good things take time to grow." While the dough rose, they called Emma's family, using the laptop's video connection to share Christmas morning across the distance. Lily showed off her dollhouse to her cousins, who proudly displayed their own gifts on camera. Emma's face appeared in the corner of the screen, her expression mixing happiness at seeing them with concern about their missed visit. "The boys made you both Christmas cards," Emma said. "I'll mail them tomorrow, along with a little something we picked out." "You don't need to send anything," Jacob protested, but Emma waved away his objections with familiar determination. "Family takes care of family, Jacob. That's what Mom and Dad taught us." After the call ended, Jacob felt the familiar weight of his sister's generosity, well-meaning, but highlighting the gap between their circumstances. Emma's family lived comfortably in a 4-bedroom house with a finished basement and a 2-car garage. Her husband's accounting practice provided steady income and benefits, allowing them to travel for hockey tournaments and take vacations that existed only in Jacob's imagination. But watching Lily arrange her wooden family in the dollhouse, narrating elaborate stories about their daily adventures, Jacob reminded himself that happiness didn't require wealth. His daughter was loved, safe, and developing into a remarkable little person, despite their financial struggles. The cinnamon rolls emerged from the oven, golden and fragrant, filling their small duplex with the kind of warmth that comes from tradition maintained against all odds. They ate them warm with butter and powdered sugar, Lily declaring them even better than the fancy ones at the bakery. "Do you think Mrs. Chen would like some?" Lily asked, eyeing the remaining rolls. "I think she'd love some. Why don't we take her a few?" Mrs. Chen answered her door wearing a silk robe and slippers, her silver hair pinned up neatly despite the early hour. Her face lit up when she saw them bearing a plate of warm cinnamon rolls. "Merry Christmas, you two. I was just thinking about making tea perfect timing." Her apartment was decorated for the holidays with understated elegancia, small tree with delicate ornaments, garland draped around doorways, and the lingering scent of jasmine incense. She served tea in china cups that had clearly been treasures from her earlier life, treating their impromptu visit like a formal occasion. "The rolls are from Mommy's recipe," Lily announced proudly. "Daddy showed me how to measure the flour and everything." "Your mother had excellent taste in recipes," Mrs. Chen said to Jacob, her eyes twinkling with approval. And clearly her daughter inherited her talent for making beautiful things. They spent an hour in Mrs. Chen's warm apartment, sharing stories and watching Lily demonstrate the dollhouse's special features. The elderly woman listened with the patience of someone who understood that children's enthusiasms were gifts to be treasured, not endured. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Rim's repassens, Chen pressed a small envelope into Jacob's hand. "A little something for the new year," she said quietly, "not a loaner gift from one neighbor to another." Jacob started to protest, but she held up a firm hand. "When I was young and struggling, an older neighbor helped me when I needed it most. Now it's my turn to help. Accept it gracefully. Someday you'll have the chance to help someone else." Back in their own apartment, Jacob opened the envelope to find 2 crisp $20 bills and a note written in Mrs. Chen's careful handwriting. "For train tickets to visit Emma, when the time is right. That evening, as Lily played quietly with her dollhouse and the snow continued to fall outside their windows, Jacob felt a deep sense of contentment despite their modest circumstances. They had celebrated Christmas with love, tradition, and the kind of simple joy that money couldn't purchase. He had no way of knowing that 300 miles away, Nora Whitman was sitting beside her mother's hospital bed, holding the train ticket that had brought her there in time to say goodbye and, miraculously, to welcome her mother back to life. He couldn't imagine that Nora was already making plans to return to Rolling Oaks, determined to find the man who had given her the most precious gift of all time with someone she loved. The week between Christmas and New Year arrived, with the peculiar stillness that settles over small towns during the holidays, when regular routines pause and time seems to move at a different pace. Jacob returned to work at Morrison Lumber with mixed feelings, grateful for the steady employment, but anxious about rumors that had been circulating since before Christmas. Pete Morrison called a meeting for the first Monday morning of the new year, gathering his workers in the break room with an expression that immediately set everyone on edge. Pete was a straight shooter who believed in treating his employees like family, which made his obvious discomfort all the more troubling. "I'm going to give it to you straight," Pete began, his weathered hands clasped in front of him. "Orders are down 30% from last year, and the bank is asking hard questions about our loan payments. I've been trying to keep everyone working full-time, but—" He paused, looking at the faces of men who had worked for him for years, some for decades. These weren't just employees, they were neighbors, friends, members of the community who depended on Morrison Lumber for their family's survival. "I have to cut hours starting next week. Nobody's getting laid off yet, but we're going to 32 hours maximum until business picks up." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken calculations. 8 fewer hours per week meant significant cuts to already tight budgets. For Jacob, it meant the difference between scraping by and falling behind, between maintaining their modest lifestyle and making impossible choices about necessities. Tommy Hendricks, who had worked at the mill longer than anyone except Pete himself, spoke for the group. "What about overtime? Any chance of weekend work?" "I wish I could say yes, but we just don't have the orders to justify it." Pete's voice carried genuine regret. "I'm hoping this is temporary. Maybe things will pick up in the spring construction season." Walking home that evening, Jacob felt the familiar weight of financial pressure settling on his shoulders. 32 hours at his current wage would barely cover their basic expenses, leaving no room for emergencies or small luxuries that made life bearable. He'd have to find additional work somewhere, but options in Rolling Oaks were limited. Lily was waiting for him at Mrs. Chen's apartment, her homework spread across the kitchen table and her expression serious with concentration. She looked up when he entered, her face brightening with the smile that never failed to lift his spirits. "I wrote my name 20 times, she announced proudly, showing him a page of carefully formed letters. "Mrs. Chen says my L's are getting much better." "They look perfect to me," Jacob said, examining her work with appropriate seriousness. "What else did you learn today?" "We talked about New Year's resolutions. Ms. Rodriguez says they're promises we make to ourselves to be better. I want to learn how to tie my shoes by myself and also how to make pancakes without help." Jacob smiled, remembering his own childhood resolutions, usually involving treats he wanted to eat or toys he hoped to acquire. Lily's goals were characteristically practical and achievable, reflecting a maturity that sometimes worried him. Over dinner, leftover soup stretched with additional vegetables, Lily chattered about her day, while Jacob listened with half his attention, the other half calculating bills and considering options for supplemental income. The mill's reduced hours would force difficult decisions, and he found himself mentally reviewing their monthly expenses for items that could be eliminated or reduced. "Daddy, you look sad," Lily observed with the directness that children sometimes bring to adult emotions. "Are you thinking about work again?" "A little bit," Jacob admitted. "Sometimes grown-ups have to think about boring things like money and jobs. Will we have enough money to buy food?" The question hit him like a physical blow, not because he couldn't answer it, but because his 5-year-old daughter had learned to worry about such fundamental necessities. Children shouldn't have to think about whether there would be enough food, but Lily had absorbed his anxieties despite his attempts to shield her from them. "We'll always have enough food," he promised firmly. "Sometimes we might eat more soup and oatmeal, but we'll never go hungry." After tucking Lily into bed with stories and songs, Jacob spread their bills across the kitchen table and began the grim arithmetic of reduced income. The mortgage payment on their duplex would consume nearly half his reduced wages, leaving precious little for utilities, groceries, and Lily's school supplies. Mrs. Chen's gift of $40 would help, but it wasn't a long-term solution. He considered calling Emma, knowing his sister would offer financial help with the same determination she brought to everything else. But accepting money from Emma felt like admitting failure, acknowledging that he couldn't provide for his own daughter without assistance. Pride was a luxury he could barely afford, yet he couldn't bring himself to make that call. Instead, he opened his laptop and began searching for part-time work in the surrounding area. Restaurant jobs, retail positions, maintenance, anything that could supplement his reduced mill income and be scheduled around his primary employment. Most opportunities required transportation to larger towns, which would eat into any additional earnings through gas costs and vehicle wear. The late-night job search became a routine over the following days, with Jacob scrolling through online listings after Lily fell asleep, applying for positions that seemed feasible and trying to maintain optimism despite limited responses. Rolling Oaks's economic decline had created competition for every available opportunity, with experienced workers willing to accept minimum wage positions that would have gone to teenagers in better times. Meanwhile, Lily seemed to sense the increased tension without understanding its source. She began making small economies without being asked, turning off lights when leaving rooms, asking for smaller portions at meals, and showing unusual interest in free activities like library, story time, and playground visits. "Can we walk to school today instead of driving?" she asked one morning, bundling herself into her winter coat. "I like seeing all the houses and looking for cats in windows." Jacob recognized the suggestion for what it was, a 5-year-old's attempt to help save money on gas. The realization that his daughter was already learning to sacrifice for their family's financial survival filled him with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. Mrs. Chen, with the intuition of someone who had lived through her own difficult times, began finding subtle ways to help without bruising Jacob's pride. Extra portions appeared when Lily had dinner at her apartment, along with leftover baked goods that needed to be eaten before they spoiled. Small gifts appeared: a warm hat that didn't fit quite right, a book that she had finished reading, art supplies that were cluttering up her apartment. "You're very kind," Jacob told her one evening when she pressed a container of homemade soup into his hands. "But you don't need to." "Neighbors help neighbors," she interrupted gently. "When my husband died, this community carried me through the hardest time of my life. Now it's my turn to help carry someone else." As January progressed with its reduced work schedule and tighter budget, Jacob found himself walking past the abandoned train station more frequently during his lunch breaks. The empty building seemed to mock his struggles, standing as a monument to Rolling Oak's better days, when jobs were plentiful and families could afford simple luxuries like Christmas train trips. He had no way of knowing that his moment of kindness on Christmas Eve had set in motion a chain of events that would soon transform not just his own life, but the future of the entire community. In a hospital room 300 miles away, Nora Whitman was making final preparations to return to Rolling Oaks, carrying with her the resources and determination to repay a debt that Jacob didn't even know existed. The train ticket he had given away in kindness would soon return to him, multiplied beyond his wildest imagination, bringing with it the chance to rebuild not just his own dreams, but the dreams of everyone who called Rolling Oaks home. The official notice arrived on a grey January morning, delivered with the casual indifference of bureaucracy to Jacob's mailbox, alongside advertisements for credit cards he couldn't afford and services he didn't need. The envelope bore the Morrison Lumber letterhead, and Jacob's hands trembled slightly as he opened it while Lily ate her breakfast cereal. Due to continued declining orders and economic pressures, Morrison Lumber regrets to inform you that your position will be eliminated effective February 15th, the letter began. Continuing with standard language about final paychecks, unused vacation time, and references for future employment. The words blurred together as Jacob read them twice, 3 times, trying to process the reality that his primary source of income would disappear in less than 3 weeks. "What's that paper, Daddy?" Lily asked, looking up from her cereal with milk dripping from her spoon. "Just some mail from work," Jacob managed, folding the letter and sliding it back into the envelope. Nothing important. But it was everything important. Without his job at the mill, their already precarious financial situation would become impossible. The reduced hours had been difficult. No hours at all would be devastating. Jacob's mind immediately began calculating unemployment benefits, would cover perhaps half their expenses, and only if his application was approved quickly. The savings account held barely enough for 1 month's bills, money he'd been hoping to preserve for true emergencies. This qualified as a true emergency. At the mill that morning, the atmosphere was subdued as word spread about the layoffs. Pete Morrison looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight, moving through the facility with the heavy step of a man forced to destroy something he'd spent his life building. 7 workers would lose their jobs, nearly half the mill's workforce, and the remaining employees would see their hours cut even further. "I'm sorry, Jake," Pete said quietly when they spoke privately in his office. "If there was any other way." "I know you tried," Jacob replied, meaning it. Pete had fought harder than most employers would have to keep his people working, taking pay cuts himself and deferring maintenance on equipment to preserve jobs. Any idea how long before things might turn around? Pete's expression provided the answer before his words did. "Honestly, I'm not sure they will. The whole region's struggling, and too many contractors are getting their lumber from the big suppliers now. We can't compete with their volume pricing." Walking through Rolling Oaks during his lunch break, Jacob saw the town's economic decline with new clarity. The empty storefronts weren't just eyesores, they were symptoms of a community bleeding jobs and young families, gradually hollowing out as opportunities disappeared. The old train station sat at the heart of this decay, its abandoned platform, a reminder of connections that had once linked Rolling Oaks to prosperity and possibility. He found himself standing on the cracked concrete where he'd made his Christmas Eve decision, remembering the desperate woman who had needed his train ticket more than he and Lily had needed their holiday plans. The memory provided small comfort now, but it also raised questions he couldn't answer. Had his act of kindness been wise, or had he simply given away something precious without considering the consequences? The afternoon brought a community meeting at the town hall, hastily organized by Mayor Patricia Wells to address the mill's layoffs and their impact on Rolling Oaks' already struggling economy. Jacob hadn't planned to attend public meetings felt like luxuries when private survival required all his attention, but Mrs. Chen insisted on watching Lily while he participated in what she called civic responsibility. The town hall's main room was half full, with familiar faces showing the strain of economic uncertainty. Business owners who had managed to keep their doors open sat beside unemployed workers, all wrestling with the same fundamental question: could Rolling Oaks survive another major blow to its economic foundation? Mayor Wells, a retired teacher who had accepted the largely ceremonial position when no one else wanted it, stood at the front of the room with a stack of papers and an expression of determined optimism that didn't quite hide her own uncertainty. "We've weathered difficult times before," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had taught high school students for 30 years. "During the recession of '08, when the factory closed in '98, even during the drought years when farming struggled, this community has always found ways to support each other and rebuild." The meeting that followed covered familiar territory budget shortfalls, declining population, the challenge of attracting new businesses to a town with limited infrastructure and a shrinking customer base. Various proposals emerged from the audience, tax incentives for new businesses, tourism initiatives based on Rolling Oak's historic charm, cooperation with neighboring communities to share resources and costs. Jacob listened with growing frustration as the discussion circled around problems without reaching solutions. Everyone understood what was wrong with Rolling Oaks, but no one seemed to have realistic ideas for fixing it. The suggestions that emerged, heritage festivals, bed and breakfast conversions, artisan craft cooperatives, felt like attempts to transform their working-class community into something it had never been. "What about the train station?" asked Sarah Kellerman, who ran the town's remaining cafe with stubborn determination despite declining customers. "It's been empty for years, and it's right in the heart of downtown. Seems like we could do something with that space." Mayor Wells nodded thoughtfully. "The building belongs to the railroad, but they've been trying to sell it for the past 5 years. Problem is, it needs significant renovation, and whoever buys it would have to come up with a viable business plan." "What kind of renovation are we talking about?" This from Bill Hayes, who had run a construction crew before the local building market collapsed. "Structural repairs, new electrical and plumbing, accessibility compliance, probably $200,000 minimum, maybe more depending on what you wanted to do with the space." The number settled over the room like a heavy blanket, effectively ending that line of discussion. $200,000 might as well have been $2 million in a community where families were choosing between heating bills and groceries. After the meeting, Jacob walked home through the January darkness, passing the train station and trying to imagine what it might become, with sufficient investment and vision. The building's bones were good solid brick construction, high ceilings, and large windows that would flood the interior with natural light if they weren't currently boarded over. In the right hands, it could become something remarkable. But remarkable required resources that Rolling Oaks simply didn't possess. At home, he found Lily and Mrs. Chen working on a puzzle at the kitchen table, their heads bent together over a picture of a steam locomotive pulling passenger cars through mountain scenery. Lily looked up when he entered, her face bright with the enthusiasm she brought to everything that captured her interest. "We're building a train, Daddy. Mrs. Chen says real trains used to stop right here in Rolling Oaks and people could ride them to exciting places." "That's right," Jacob confirmed, hanging up his coat and joining them at the table. "The train station downtown used to be very busy, with people coming and going every day." "Could we ride a train someday?" Lily asked, fitting a puzzle piece into place with careful precision. Jacob met Mrs. Chen's eyes across the table, seeing understanding and sympathy in her expression. "Maybe someday," he said, meaning it despite not knowing how such a someday might ever arrive. Later that evening, after Lily was asleep and Mrs. Chen had returned to her own apartment, Jacob sat at his laptop, searching for jobs with renewed urgency. The unemployment benefits would help, but they wouldn't be enough to maintain their current life. He might have to consider relocating, leaving Rolling Oaks for communities with better economic opportunities, abandoning the place where he and Sarah had planned to raise their family. The thought of leaving felt like another kind of death, the final abandonment of dreams that had already been wounded beyond easy repair. But sometimes survival required sacrifice, and Jacob was beginning to understand that his pride might be a luxury he could no longer afford. Jacob's final day at Morrison Lumber arrived with a kind of bone-deep cold that made every breath visible and turned car engines into reluctant partners in the morning routine. He'd spent the previous evening cleaning out his locker and saying goodbye to equipment that had become as familiar as his own hands-the-table saw, where he'd cut thousands of board feet, the forklift that had carried him through countless shifts, the break room where he'd shared coffee and conversation with men who understood the dignity of physical work. Pete Morrison met him at the time clock, holding an envelope that contained Jacob's final paycheck, along with a letter of recommendation written with obvious care and genuine affection. "This doesn't feel right," Pete said, his voice rough with emotion. "You've been one of my best workers for 8 years. If things turn around—" "I know," Jacob interrupted gently. "You've been a good boss, Pete. Fair and honest. Not everyone gets that." They shook hands with the firmness of men who respected each other, and Jacob walked out of Morrison Lumber for the last time, carrying a small box of personal items and the weight of uncertainty about what came next. At home, he found Lily playing with her dollhouse while Mrs. Chen prepared what smelled like homemade soup. His daughter looked up when he entered, her face immediately registering concern at his early arrival. "Why are you home, Daddy? Are you sick?" Jacob sat beside her on the floor, watching her arrange the tiny wooden family in their miniature rooms. "Remember how we talked about how sometimes grown-ups have to look for new jobs? Well, now it's my turn to look for one." Lily considered this information with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "Will we have to move away?" The question hit him squarely in the chest, because it was the same one that had been keeping him awake at night. The job search in Rolling Oaks and the surrounding area had yielded nothing promising. A few part-time retail positions, some seasonal agricultural work, and one maintenance job that paid barely above minimum wage. To find employment that could support their family, he might indeed have to look beyond their small community. "I hope not," he said honestly, "but sometimes families have to go where the jobs are." "I don't want to leave, Mrs. Chen," Lily said quietly, moving the wooden mother figure to the dollhouse kitchen. "And I don't want to leave my school or my teacher or the library where they know what books I like." Jacob's throat tightened as he listened to his daughter list the connections that made Rolling Oaks home, despite its economic struggles. She had no memory of their life before this duplex, no understanding of opportunities that might exist in other places. This struggling town was her whole world, and he was contemplating tearing her away from everything familiar. That evening, while Lily slept, Jacob spread job listings across the kitchen table and began the grim process of calculating distance, salary, and cost of living for positions in larger communities. A warehouse job in the county seat paid better than anything local, but the commute would consume gas money and time away from Lily. A construction position 3 hours north offered good wages, but would require relocating to a region where he knew no one, and housing costs were significantly higher. Mrs. Chen appeared at his door near 9 o'clock, carrying a tea service and wearing the expression of someone who had made a decision. "You look like a man who could use some company," she said, setting the tray on his table without waiting for invitation. "And I have something to discuss with you." Jacob accepted the cup of jasmine tea gratefully, appreciating both the warmth and the gentle intrusion of someone who cared about his family's welfare. "Lily told me you might have to move away," Mrs. Chen said without preamble. "She's very worried about leaving everything she knows." "I'm worried about it too," Jacob admitted, "but I have to provide for her, and the opportunities here are limited," Mrs. Chen finished. "Yes, I understand that. But before you make any drastic decisions, I want you to consider something." She reached into her handbag and withdrew a small business card, placing it on the table between them. The card was elegant, heavy stock with embossed lettering. "Nora Whitman, Urban Development Consulting." Jacob stared at the card, feeling a strange chill of recognition. "Whitman, isn't that the name of the woman at the train station? The one who took your train ticket on Christmas Eve," Mrs. Chen confirmed. "She came by this afternoon, looking for you. Apparently, she's been trying to track you down for weeks." The implications of this statement hung in the air like smoke from a disturbed fire. Jacob picked up the business card, running his thumb over the expensive printing while trying to process why the desperate woman from Christmas Eve would be seeking him out. What did she want? "To thank you, first of all. Her mother recovered. It wasn't as serious as they initially thought. But more than that, she wants to discuss what she calls a business proposition. Something about the old train station." Jacob's mind raced back to the community meeting, to the discussions about the abandoned depot and its potential for redevelopment. The building that needed $200,000 in renovations, the space that could become something remarkable in the right hands. Did she say what kind of business proposition? Mrs. Chen smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting all evening to deliver this information. "She wants to renovate the train station and turn it into some kind of community center." Apparently, she specializes in historic preservation and downtown revitalization projects. She's done similar work in small towns across the Midwest. Jacob felt a flutter of something he didn't dare identify as hope. But the money the renovation costs alone. She said to tell you that money isn't the primary obstacle. The primary obstacle is finding someone local who understands the community and can manage the project properly. Mrs. Chen leaned forward, her eyes bright with possibility. Someone who knows construction, who has the respect of the community, who can bridge the gap between outside investment and local needs. The business card felt warm in Jacob's hands, as if it carried the heat of possibilities he hadn't dared to imagine. A woman he'd helped for 5 minutes on Christmas Eve had somehow become his potential salvation, offering not just employment, but the chance to rebuild something meaningful in the community he loved. "She wants to meet with you tomorrow," Mrs. Chen continued. "She's staying at the Riverside Inn until Sunday, hoping you'll hear her out." That night, Jacob lay awake staring at the ceiling and listening to Lily's peaceful breathing across the room. The business card sat on his nightstand, a small rectangle that might represent the difference between leaving Rolling Oaks in defeat and staying to help restore it to something resembling its former glory. He thought about Sarah, about the dreams they'd shared for their family's future in this community. She had believed in the power of small kindnesses, in the way individual actions could ripple outward to create unexpected changes. His decision to give away their train ticket had been simple human decency, not calculated generosity. Yet somehow, that moment of compassion was returning to him, transformed into opportunity. As January wind rattled their windows and snow continued to fall over Rolling Oaks, Jacob allowed himself to imagine a different future, one where he didn't have to choose between providing for his daughter and remaining in the place they both called home. Tomorrow would bring answers to questions he hadn't even known he should be asking, and for the first time in months, Jacob fell asleep with anticipation rather than anxiety filling his thoughts. The luxury sedan appeared outside Jacob's duplex at exactly 10 o'clock Saturday morning, its dark paint and chrome details looking distinctly out of place on a street where most vehicles bore the honest scars of hard use and tight budgets. Jacob had been watching from the window since 9:30, nervous energy, making it impossible to focus on anything else while Lily played contentedly with her dollhouse. Nora Whitman emerged from the car wearing a wool coat that probably cost more than Jacob's monthly grocery budget, but her expression carried none of the arrogance he might have expected from someone driving such obvious wealth. Instead, she looked nervous, almost hesitant, as she approached his front door. Jacob opened it before she could knock, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, the desperate woman from Christmas Eve, and the man who had given her his family's only chance at holiday, joy. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice carrying genuine warmth, "I wasn't sure you'd agree to see me." "Mrs. Chen said you had a business proposition," Jacob replied, stepping aside to let her enter. "Though, I have to admit, I'm curious how giving you a train ticket turned into a business meeting." Nora smiled, and Jacob saw traces of the tears and desperation from Christmas Eve transformed into determination and purpose. She carried a leather portfolio and moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to presenting complex ideas to skeptical audiences. "Is this the famous Lily?" she asked, kneeling beside the dollhouse where Jacob's daughter was arranging tiny furniture with intense concentration. Lily looked up shyly, then recognition dawned on her face. "You're the sad lady from the train station. Are you not sad anymore?" "Much less sad, thanks to you and your daddy," Nora replied gently. "My mother is feeling much better now. She's back home and cooking again, which the doctors say is a very good sign." "That's good," Lily said with the matter-of-fact kindness that never failed to amaze Jacob. "Daddy says helping people feel better is one of the most important things we can do." Jacob felt heat rise in his cheeks at having his parenting philosophy quoted back to him, but Nora's expression suggested she found the sentiment admirable rather than naive. "Your daddy is absolutely right," she said, standing and turning her attention to Jacob. Which brings me to why I'm here. May I show you something? Jacob gestured toward their small kitchen table, the only surface large enough to accommodate whatever presentation she had prepared. Nora opened her portfolio and withdrew a set of architectural drawings that immediately captured his attention with their professional detail and ambitious scope. "These are preliminary plans for the Rolling Oaks Community Station," she began, spreading the papers across the table. "A complete renovation of the old train depot, designed to serve as both a community center and a sustainable business venture." Jacob studied the drawings with growing amazement. The plans showed the abandoned station transformed into something beautiful and functional, a large open space that could serve multiple purposes: smaller rooms for classes and meetings, a commercial kitchen, and what appeared to be a children's area complete with reading nooks and play spaces. "This is incredible work," he said, running his finger along the careful lines that showed electrical systems and structural modifications. "But the cost? Let me worry about the cost." Nora interrupted gently. "What I need from you is something much more valuable than money. I need someone who understands this community, who has the construction experience to oversee the project, and who has the trust and respect of the people who live here." Jacob looked up from the drawings, confusion evident on his face. "I don't understand. We've met exactly once, for maybe 5 minutes. How do you know anything about my construction experience, or standing in the community?" Nora's expression became more serious, and she pulled a chair closer to the table before continuing. "After my mother was stabilized, I spent 3 days in university hospital with nothing to do but think about the stranger who had saved my chance to say goodbye. I couldn't stop wondering about the man who would give away his family's Christmas to help someone he'd never met." She reached into her portfolio again and withdrew a manila folder thick with papers. "So I did what I do for a living. I researched Rolling Oaks, its economic history, its current challenges, and the people who are working to keep this community alive, despite the odds." Jacob opened the folder to find newspaper clippings, demographic reports, and what appeared to be interviews with local residents. His own name appeared in several documents letters to the editor about school funding, participation in volunteer projects, and quotes from co-workers praising his work ethic and character. "Mrs. Chen wasn't the only person I spoke with," Nora continued. "I talked to your former boss, Pete Morrison, to Mayor Wells, to your daughter's teacher, and to several other people who know you and your family. The picture that emerged was of someone who embodies exactly what I've been looking for: a person with deep roots in the community, practical skills, and the kind of integrity that makes people trust his judgment." Jacob felt overwhelmed by the scope of her investigation, uncertain whether to be flattered or unsettled by such thorough scrutiny. "This is a lot to process. What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing to renovate the train station using my own capital investment, with you as project manager and eventual operational director. The facility would combine several revenue streams: a coffee shop and light cafe, meeting space rental, community classes and workshops, and a childcare center for working parents." She pulled out financial projections that showed impressive potential returns, but Jacob's attention was caught by one particular element of the plan: a childcare center. "Rolling Oaks has dozens of families with young children and no local daycare options," Nora explained. "Parents have to drive 40 minutes each way to the county seat, which limits employment opportunities and strains family budgets. A community-based childcare center could serve local families while providing steady revenue for the facility's operation." Jacob thought about his own struggles with childcare, the way Mrs. Chen's generosity had made his work schedule possible, the conversations he'd overheard from other parents facing similar challenges. "The numbers look good on paper," he said carefully, "but why would you invest this kind of money in a town you barely know? What's your real interest in Rolling Oaks?" Nora was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the architectural drawings. When she spoke again, her voice carried a vulnerability that reminded Jacob of the desperate woman from Christmas Eve. "I grew up in a town very much like this one, smaller than what I needed, economically struggling, full of people who knew each other's stories and cared about each other's well-being. I left for college and never went back. Built a successful career, helping other people preserve and revitalize the kinds of places I had abandoned. She looked around Jacob's modest kitchen, taking in the carefully maintained but obviously worn surroundings. When you gave me that train ticket, you reminded me of something I'd forgotten, that the measure of a community isn't its economic indicators or development potential. It's the character of the people who choose to stay and fight for something better. So this is charity? Jacob asked, not unkindly but needing to understand her motivations. No, Nora replied firmly. This is investment. I believe Rolling Oaks has unrealized potential, and I believe you're the person who can help unlock it. I'm offering you a job, not a handout, a salary competitive with anything you'd find in the region, plus a percentage of the facility's profits as it becomes established. Jacob stared at the architectural drawings, seeing not just lines on paper, but the possibility of transformation for himself, for Lily, for the entire community that had shaped their lives. The abandoned train station that had symbolized Rolling Oaks' decline could become a symbol of renewal instead, a place where children played and families gathered and dreams took root in familiar soil. I need time to think about this, he said finally. Of course. But don't take too long. I've already put a deposit down on the building, and I'd like to begin renovation by early spring. Nora gathered her papers, but left the architectural drawings on the table. Study these, think about what this could mean for Rolling Oaks, and call me when you're ready to discuss details. After she left, Jacob sat at the kitchen table, staring at the plans, while Lily continued playing with her dollhouse. The parallel wasn't lost on him, his daughter creating imaginary communities in miniature, while he contemplated the chance to rebuild a real one. The train ticket he had given away in kindness had returned to him, transformed into possibility beyond his wildest imagination. February arrived with unseasonable warmth that turned Rolling Oaks' snow into muddy slush and filled the air with the promise of early spring. Jacob had spent 2 weeks studying Nora's architectural plans, discussing the project with Mrs. Chen, and wrestling with a decision that would reshape not just his own future but potentially the entire community's trajectory. The skepticism he'd initially felt had gradually given way to cautious optimism as he researched Nora's background and discovered an impressive portfolio of successful rural revitalization projects. She had transformed dying mill towns in Pennsylvania, brought new life to farming communities in Iowa, and created sustainable economic models that honored local character while attracting outside investment. His call to accept her offer had led to a whirlwind of activity, meetings with contractors, sessions with city planners, and long conversations with community leaders who ranged from enthusiastic to suspicious about the ambitious project taking shape in their midst. "I still can't believe it," Pete Morrison said, shaking his head as he walked through the empty train station with Jacob and Nora on a grey February morning. 3 months ago, we were talking about whether Rolling Oaks had any future at all. Now you're planning to turn this old building into some kind of community hub. The interior of the station was both more promising and more challenging than Jacob had expected. The bones of the structure were solid, beautiful brick walls, soaring ceilings with original wooden beams, and large windows that would flood the space with natural light once they were unboarded and restored. But decades of neglect had taken their toll in the form of water damage, outdated electrical systems, and accessibility issues that would require significant modification. "The foundation is excellent," Bill Hayes reported, emerging from the basement with a flashlight and a clipboard covered in notes. "Some settling in the northeast corner, but nothing that can't be addressed. The real work will be updating everything else to modern standards." Nora moved through the space with the confidence of someone who had seen potential in dozens of similar buildings, pointing out possibilities that Jacob was only beginning to envision. Where he saw peeling paint and cracked plaster, she saw exposed brick walls and original architectural details waiting to be highlighted. Where he saw empty rooms, she saw flexible spaces that could serve multiple community needs. The main waiting area, will become our central gathering space, she explained, gesturing toward the large room that dominated the building's footprint. High-top tables for the coffee shop, comfortable seating areas for reading and conversation, and open floor space for community events and presentations. Jacob studied the area with his contractor's eye, already calculating the electrical work needed for proper lighting and the HVAC modifications required to heat and cool the expansive space efficiently. We'll need to add insulation throughout the building and probably install a completely new climate control system. The budget accounts for all of that, Nora assured him. I'd rather do this right the first time than cut corners and regret it later. The scope of her financial commitment continued to amaze Jacob. The preliminary budget exceeded $300,000, money that Nora seemed prepared to invest based on little more than faith in the community's potential and confidence in his ability to manage the project. What about staffing? He asked, as they moved through the smaller rooms that would house the childcare center. A facility this size will need employees, and Rolling Oaks doesn't exactly have a deep pool of qualified candidates. We'll train our own people, Nora replied. Mrs. Chen has already agreed to help design the childcare program, and she knows several other retired teachers who might be interested in part-time work. The coffee shop can start with basic offerings and expand as we build customer base and experience. The mention of Mrs. Chen brought a smile to Jacob's face. His elderly neighbor had embraced the project with enthusiasm that surprised everyone, volunteering to contribute her teaching experience and offering to invest her own modest savings in what she called the most exciting thing to happen in Rolling Oaks since the bicentennial celebration. As they continued their tour, Jacob found himself imagining the building filled with life children playing in the daycare area while their parents worked, teenagers studying at tables near the large windows, elderly residents gathering for morning coffee and conversation. The vision felt both ambitious and achievable, a realistic path toward the kind of community vitality that Rolling Oaks had been missing for years. When do you want to start construction? He asked, already mentally organizing the sequence of work that would transform the architectural drawings into reality. As soon as the permits are approved and the weather cooperates, Nora said. I'm hoping we can begin major work by the end of March and have the facility ready for a soft opening by early summer. The timeline was aggressive but manageable, assuming they could secure reliable contractors and avoid major complications during the renovation process. Jacob had already begun reaching out to local craftsmen and suppliers, many of whom were eager for substantial work after a difficult winter of reduced construction activity. That evening, he sat at his kitchen table with spreadsheets and schedules, planning the project that would consume the next several months of his life. Lily worked on homework beside him, occasionally asking questions about the mysterious adult activity that seemed to involve so much paperwork and serious conversation. "Are you going to build something, Daddy?" she asked, looking up from her math worksheet. "We're going to fix up the old train station and turn it into a place where families can bring their children during the day," Jacob explained, "kind of like a big playroom and cafe combined." Lily considered this information with her characteristic thoughtfulness. Will there be other kids to play with? Lots of other kids, and books and games, and places to do art projects. Can I help build it? Jacob smiled, remembering his own childhood fascination with construction projects and the patient contractors who had let him help by carrying small tools and sweeping up sawdust. You can definitely help with some parts, maybe painting or organizing supplies or testing the playground equipment to make sure it's fun. The idea of involving Lily in the project appealed to Jacob on multiple levels. She would learn valuable lessons about work and community, while also developing a sense of ownership in the facility that would serve families like theirs for years to come. Over the following weeks, the Rolling Oaks Community Station project gained momentum that surprised even its most optimistic supporters. The City Council approved the necessary permits with unusual speed, recognizing the economic development opportunity that Nora's investment represented. Local contractors submitted competitive bids for various aspects of the work, grateful for the substantial project that would employ their crews through the traditionally slow spring months. The broader community's reaction was more mixed. Some residents embraced the project with enthusiasm, seeing it as exactly the kind of innovation Rolling Oaks needed to attract young families and support existing ones. Others viewed it with suspicion, concerned about outside influence and skeptical of promises that seemed too good to be true. "Change is always scary," Mrs. Chen observed during one of their evening tea conversations, "especially when you've been disappointed before. But sometimes you have to take risks to create opportunities." Jacob found himself becoming an unofficial spokesman for the project, answering questions at the grocery store, explaining details during chance encounters on Main Street, and reassuring skeptics that the renovation would respect the building's historic character while adapting it for modern needs. "The important thing is that this will be our facility," he emphasized during a community meeting in early March. "Designed by us, for us, to serve our families and support our local economy. Yes, Mrs. Whitman is providing the initial investment, but the success of the project depends on all of us working together to make it something special." As construction preparations intensified and the March weather began cooperating with outdoor work, Jacob felt a growing sense of anticipation mixed with responsibility. The abandoned train station that had symbolized Rolling Oaks' decline was about to become the centerpiece of its renewal, and he was the person trusted to oversee that transformation. The weight of the community's hopes rode on his shoulders as he prepared to begin the most important project of his professional life, turning architectural drawings into reality, transforming empty spaces into gathering places, and proving that sometimes the greatest changes begin with the smallest acts of kindness. The train ticket he had given away on Christmas Eve had set in motion a chain of events that would soon reshape not just the old depot, but the entire community's sense of what was possible when people worked together toward a common goal. Grand opening day for the Rolling Oaks Community Station arrived, with the kind of perfect June weather that seemed designed specifically for celebration. Jacob stood on the newly restored platform at 7 in the morning, watching the sunrise paint the brick walls golden and reflecting on the 4 months of intensive work that had transformed the abandoned depot into something beyond even Nora's ambitious architectural plans. The building behind him hummed with quiet activity as final preparations continued for the 10 o'clock ribbon-cutting ceremony. Mrs. Chen and her team of volunteer staff members arranged pastries and coffee service in the main gathering area, while Lily and several other children tested the playground equipment one final time with the serious attention that only young quality control inspectors could provide. "Daddy, the little slide makes a funny noise when you go down it," Lily called from the children's area, her voice echoing in the high-ceilinged space. "But it's a good funny noise, not a broken noise." Jacob smiled, remembering the countless design decisions and construction challenges that had been resolved through exactly that kind of practical testing. The Rolling Oaks Community Station had become a true collaboration between professional expertise and local wisdom, with community members contributing ideas that had improved every aspect of the final product. The transformation was remarkable. Where boarded windows had once blocked natural light, large panes of restored glass now offered views of the surrounding town and filled the interior with warmth. The original wooden beams had been cleaned and reinforced, their natural beauty highlighted rather than hidden. Modern, amenity-sufficient heating and cooling, updated electrical systems, accessible restroom shad, been seamlessly integrated with the building's historic character. The main gathering space featured a coffee bar managed by Sarah Kellerman, whose cafe experience had proven invaluable in designing both the service area and the menu of locally sourced refreshments. High-top tables and comfortable seating areas created flexible zones for work, conversation, and community events, while maintaining clear sightlines to the children's area where parents could keep watch while socializing or working. The Child Care Center occupied the building's former freight area, transformed into bright, safe spaces equipped with age-appropriate toys, educational materials, and outdoor access to a newly constructed playground. Mrs. Chen's vision of nurturing young minds had shaped every detail, from the reading nook with its built-in benches to the art station with washable surfaces and abundant storage for creative supplies. 5 minutes until the first guests arrive, Nora announced. Emerging from the small office where she had been making final phone calls to the regional media representatives who would document Rolling Oaks' transformation. She wore a simple blue dress that honored the occasion's importance without overshadowing the community members who were the real stars of this celebration. Jacob checked his own appearance in the reflection of the large windows, adjusting the tie that felt strange after months of work clothes and construction boots. The formal clothing seemed appropriate for the ceremony, but foreign after the hands-on experience of bringing the project to life through physical labor and problem-solving. Nervous? Nora asked, joining him on the platform where a ribbon waited to be cut in less than 3 hours. Excited, Jacob replied honestly. This feels like the beginning of something important, not just the end of a construction project. The early arrivals began appearing shortly after 9:30 families with young children, elderly residents curious about the changes, and business owners interested in the economic development potential that the facility represented. Jacob watched from inside as the parking area filled with cars, and the platform welcomed visitors who had come to see what their community had accomplished. Mayor Wells arrived precisely on time, carrying a proclamation that would officially designate the day as Community Renewal Day in Rolling Oaks. Pete Morrison and his former mill workers toured the building with obvious pride, pointing out construction details they had contributed during the renovation process. Emma and her family had driven down from Millbrook, bringing Jacob's nephews to see the project their uncle had managed and to meet the woman whose gratitude had set everything in motion. "Uncle Jake, this is so cool," 10-year-old Michael exclaimed, racing through the children's area with his younger brother close behind. "It's like a giant playground inside a castle." The comparison made Jacob laugh, but it wasn't entirely inaccurate. The restored train station did have a castle-like quality, with its solid brick construction and tower-like waiting room rising above the surrounding buildings like a fortress of community hope. As 10 o'clock approached and the crowd gathered on the platform, Jacob found himself standing beside the ribbon with large scissors in his hands, surrounded by the people who had made this transformation possible. Mrs. Chen held one end of the ribbon, while Lily held the other, their faces bright with anticipation and pride. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mayor Wells announced through a borrowed microphone, "it is my great pleasure to officially open the Rolling Oaks Community Station, a facility built by this community, for this community, with the vision and generosity of our friends who believed in our potential." Jacob raised the scissors, meeting Nora's eyes across the small crowd, and seeing reflected there the same sense of completion and new beginning that filled his own heart. The ribbon fell away in 2 pieces as applause erupted from the crowd gathered on the platform, and Jacob felt a surge of emotion that caught him completely off guard. This moment represented more than the completion of a construction project. It symbolized the community's faith in its own future and his personal journey from desperation to purpose. "We did it, Daddy," Lily exclaimed, throwing her arms around his waist and squeezing with 5-year-old enthusiasm. "We built something beautiful." The first visitors streamed through the doors with the eager curiosity of people exploring a space that belonged to them, their voices creating an immediate atmosphere of warmth and discovery. Jacob watched families navigate the children's area, elderly residents settle into comfortable chairs with appreciative sighs, and teenagers examined the study spaces with obvious approval. Mrs. Chen had positioned herself behind the coffee bar alongside Sarah Kellerman, serving local pastries and freshly brewed coffee while sharing stories about the building's transformation with anyone willing to listen. Her pride in the project was infectious, and Jacob could see visitors catching her enthusiasm as she described the thoughtful details that made the space both functional and welcoming. The reading nook was designed specifically for story time, she explained to a young mother whose toddler was already climbing onto the built-in benches. We wanted children to associate this place with learning and discovery, not just childcare. Nora moved through the crowd with gracious attention, answering questions about the renovation process and listening to suggestions for future programming. Jacob noticed how skillfully she redirected credit toward the community members who had contributed to the project's success, emphasizing local ownership while downplaying her own role as benefactor. "This is your facility," he heard her tell a group of parents examining the childcare center. "We've provided the infrastructure, but you'll determine what programs and services best meet your family's needs." The outdoor playground drew immediate attention from children who had been waiting patiently through the adult ceremony. Jacob watched Lily lead a tour for her new friends, explaining the equipment with the authority of someone who had participated in its testing and approval. Her natural leadership and obvious comfort in the space filled him with quiet pride. Pete Morrison appeared at Jacob's elbow, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing an expression of wonder that reflected the sentiments of many long-time residents. "6 months ago, I was laying off half my workforce and wondering if Rolling Oaks had any future at all," Pete said quietly. "Now look at this place. Look at these families. You've given us something to build on again." Jacob accepted the compliment, but felt compelled to correct the attribution. "We all did this together. I just happened to be the guy who met the right person at the right moment." "That's exactly my point," Pete replied. "You made a choice that day at the train station, a choice that put someone else's needs ahead of your own. That's character, Jake. That's the kind of foundation that real communities are built on." As the afternoon progressed, the opening celebration evolved into something more organic and lasting, families lingering over coffee while children played, teenagers discovering the homework-friendly environment, and elderly residents finding comfortable spots for conversation and observation. The building was fulfilling its designed purpose of bringing people together, creating connections that went beyond the specific services it provided. Emma found Jacob during a quiet moment, when the initial excitement had settled into comfortable occupancy and the facility was demonstrating its potential for daily community life. "I'm proud of you," she said simply, linking her arm through his as they watched Lily teach origami to a group of fascinated children. "Not just for managing this project, but for staying true to yourself and your values through everything that's happened." Jacob felt the weight of the past year, the job loss, the financial stress, the uncertainty about their future transforming into gratitude for the journey that had led them to this moment. The struggles had been real and difficult, but they had also prepared him to recognize and embrace an opportunity that might have seemed impossible under different circumstances. "I keep thinking about that train ticket," he admitted, "how something that felt like a sacrifice at the time turned out to be the best investment I ever made." "Maybe that's how kindness works," Emma suggested. "You plant seeds without knowing what will grow, and sometimes you get surprised by the harvest." As evening approached and the opening day celebration began winding down, Jacob found himself alone with Nora in the main gathering space, surrounded by the evidence of their successful collaboration, but finally able to speak privately about what they had accomplished together. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling inadequate for the magnitude of change she had brought to his life and community. "Thank you," she replied, gesturing toward the families, still enjoying the space around them. "You gave me something I didn't even know I was looking for, the chance to be part of a community that values what really matters." Jacob looked around the transformed station, listening to the sounds of children playing and adults conversing, and realized that the building had become exactly what Nora had envisioned, not just a facility, but a focal point for the kind of connections that make a place worth calling home. Christmas Eve, 1 year later, found Jacob standing once again on the platform of the Rolling Oaks community station, but this time the scene bore no resemblance to the desperate moment that had changed everything. The restored depot glowed with warm light from every window, filled with families celebrating the holiday season and the remarkable transformation their community had experienced. Inside, the main gathering space hosted the annual Christmas party that had become Rolling Oaks' most anticipated holiday tradition. Children, who attended the station's daycare program, performed carols they had learned from Mrs. 17. Chen, while parents lingered over hot cider and homemade cookies, reluctant to end an evening that perfectly captured the spirit of community renewal. Lily, now 6 and confident beyond her years, stood at the center of the children's choir, wearing a red velvet dress that Emma had sent for the occasion. Her voice rose clear and sweet above the others as they sang "Silent Night," the same song Sarah had hummed to her as a baby, creating a bridge between past and present that filled Jacob's heart with gratitude for the continuity of love across generations. The restored train schedule board, now repurposed to display community events and announcements, showed the busy calendar that had made the station a true hub of local activity. Morning coffee groups for seniors, after-school tutoring for teenagers, weekend craft workshops for families, and evening book clubs for adults had created programming that served every demographic while generating the steady revenue stream that made the facility financially sustainable. Mrs. Chen, now the official director of children's programming, moved through the party with the satisfaction of someone whose vision had exceeded even her own ambitious expectations. The daycare center served 23 families, allowing parents to work locally instead of commuting to distant jobs, while the various classes and workshops had attracted participants from neighboring towns who brought both enthusiasm and economic activity to Rolling Oaks. The applications for next year's preschool program are already coming in, she told Jacob as they watched the children's performance. We may need to expand into the storage room to accommodate demand. The station's success had catalyzed broader changes throughout Rolling Oaks. 3 new businesses had opened on Main Street, taking advantage of increased foot traffic and the growing reputation of the town as a family-friendly community with strong support systems. The local real estate market had stabilized as young families chose to stay or relocate to Rolling Oaks specifically for access to the services and connections the station provided. Pete Morrison had reopened his lumber mill with a smaller but steady workforce, serving the construction projects that were transforming downtown storefronts into viable businesses again. The economic multiplier effect that Nora had predicted was proving accurate. Initial investment in community infrastructure was generating sustainable local prosperity. Ladies and gentlemen, Mayor Wells announced as the children's concert concluded, I'd like to ask our station director to say a few words about the year we've had. Jacob stepped forward with the easy confidence he had developed through a year of public speaking and community leadership. The role of station director had required skills he hadn't known. He possessed budget management, program coordination, staff supervision, and public relations. But each challenge had built his capacity for the next one. 12 months ago, this building was empty, and our community was struggling to imagine a different future, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the warm space. Tonight, as we celebrate another Christmas together, I think we can all see that the future we hoped for wasn't just a dream, it was a possibility that required us to work together and believe in each other. He paused, looking around the room at faces that had become deeply familiar, families whose children he watched grow day by day, elderly residents who had found new purpose in volunteering, teenagers who had discovered that their hometown offered opportunities worth pursuing. The station had become more than a building. It was the physical embodiment of Rolling Oaks' renewed sense of community. But the real magic of this place isn't in the programs we offer or the services we provide, Jacob continued. It's in the connections we make, the friendships we build, and the way we support each other through all of life's moments, both the celebrations and the challenges. Spontaneous applause filled the space, but Jacob raised his hand to indicate he wasn't finished. I also want to acknowledge someone whose generosity made all of this possible, but whose greatest gift wasn't financial, it was her faith in our community's potential. He turned toward Nora, who stood near the coffee bar, wearing the kind of smile that suggested she was exactly where she belonged. Nora Whitman believed in Rolling Oaks before we fully believed in ourselves, and she gave us the tools to build the future we wanted. The applause that followed was warmer and more sustained, acknowledging not just Nora's initial investment, but her ongoing commitment to the community she had chosen to call home. Her decision to relocate permanently to Rolling Oaks had surprised many people, but it had also demonstrated the depth of her commitment to the project's long-term success. As the party gradually wound down and families began gathering their belongings, Jacob found himself in the quiet moment he had been anticipating all evening. He walked to the small memorial corner where Sarah's photograph sat surrounded by flowers from the station's garden, a space where he came each day to share the details of their transformed life. "She would have loved this place," Nora said quietly, joining him in front of the memorial display. "Mrs. Chen told me how much Sarah valued community connections and bringing people together." Jacob nodded, feeling Sarah's presence in the laughter of children, the conversations of friends, and the sense of belonging that filled every corner of the restored station. The building had become a living memorial to the values she had held dear: kindness, generosity, and the belief that individual actions could create ripples of positive change. "I keep thinking about that train ticket," he said, echoing words he had spoken exactly 1 year earlier. "How a simple choice led to all of this." "Maybe that's the point," Nora replied, taking his hand as they watched the last families of the evening saying their goodbyes. "We never know which moments will change everything, so we have to treat each opportunity for kindness like it might be the most important thing we ever do." Outside the windows, snow was beginning to fall over Rolling Oaks, covering the town in the same peaceful beauty that had marked the Christmas Eve when everything changed. But this time, the community it blanketed was vibrant with purpose and rich with connections that would endure far beyond any single season of celebration. The train ticket had found its way home, transformed into something larger and more lasting than either Jacob or Nora could have imagined, a testament to the power of small kindnesses to create extraordinary change.